Hey, Dr. Scott here, and welcome to Leading in 10, the live stream designed to help you amplify your effectiveness in leading yourself and others in only 10 minutes. Now, we've all heard the phrase culture eats strategy for breakfast, but what does it really mean? Today, we'll be exploring that idea with Assistant Commissioner Tim Loh, who brings a wealth of experience in building high-performance teams. Tim believes that strategy matters, but without the right culture, even the best strategies fall short. So, Tim, thanks for joining us today. It's often said that culture eats strategy. What do people generally mean by this, and what's your experience with this?
Thanks for having me, Scott. Really grateful to be here today. Look, when I hear that phrase, I think of it as two things. I think culture is absolutely important when it comes to a high performance team, but so is strategy as well. But if you don't have the culture, whatever the strategy looks like or however you execute it, you'll never achieve the outcomes that you want from that strategy. So for me, it's so important to create a really high performing culture in order to achieve the goals that you want for yourself, your team, and the organization that you work in.
So you've come up with your own model in a way that is backed by a lot of science. We'll get into this in a minute. And what have you called it?
Look, I've called it a triple A culture rating. So you might have heard of the term triple A credit rating. It's a term that credit rating agencies use. So I've termed it a triple A culture rating for cultures of high performing teams. And the three A's stand for acceptance, appreciation, and acknowledgement. And that's what the three A's stand for.
So let's actually just walk through each of these, because I think that they're really interesting when you get into the science behind each. So let's start with acceptance. What's your definition of acceptance?
Yeah, so for me, Scott, like acceptance means making sure that every team member in your team feels like they're seen. So I like to do as a leader when I'm leading teams to make sure, especially our new team members, when they come on board, that they feel really welcome. So that's how I define that word, acceptance.
So I'd like to overlay a couple of ideas on this. I'll piggyback, because when I hear you talk
Yeah,
about acceptance, there's a couple of categories that I
yeah,
think is actually really important. So
yeah.
first of all, I think we've talked about this before, is the difference between in-group and out-group and how that
Mm,
actually impacts dynamics. So as we discussed before, the brain has this mirror system that generally,
yep,
if I see somebody feeling a particular way, my brain feels or experiences what they're experiencing.
mm,
So it actually mirrors their emotional state. So I have this natural empathy. But the interesting thing that is that only works if they're in your in group, perceived in group.
yep,
If they're in your out group, the brain actually does the opposite. So the brain actually celebrates at their demise if they're in the
yeah,
out group. So evolutionary speaking, that makes a lot of sense. So
yeah,
this idea of acceptance is really important psychologically, to view other people as being on the same team, accepted into the clan, that sort of stuff
yeah,
is actually really important. I think the other thing that people are getting more mindful of is things like diversity and neurodiversity. And in some sense, acknowledging that and shaping the roles to fit their personalities to some degree. Does that resonate with you?
yeah. It does, Scott. And I think that's a really pertinent point, right, around that diversity aspect, right? And you wanted to create a team where they're not mini me's of you, right? But you want them to be really bringing their own personality to the team and bringing their ideas to the team as well. I think that's such an important piece, and we can talk a bit more about that because I think it touches on that second A. But yeah, I think it's really important that when you bring someone into your team, they do feel seen, do feel like they're accepted, and as you point out, making sure they feel part of that in group rather than the out group.
Yeah, yeah. And I love the idea of having acceptance cards. The other one that people use is the user manuals. So that idea
Yes,
of how do I like to be treated? What's my background? What are my interests? And
yeah,
being able to, say this is how you should be treating me. And so
yeah,
accepting those boundaries again is having that communication. There's a number of ways of doing that. But yeah, I love the idea of having some sort of card or bi-directional flow of information of this
yeah,
is who I am, this is how I like to be treated, this is how I work best. And
yeah.
having that upfront conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Scott. And we also do something very similar to that, but more on a personal level. So we have what I like to term town halls every month, and we have this agenda item. It's called Pictures of You, Pictures of Me, and you share a bit of information about your career, but also your personal life. Everyone in the team gets to know it. It's a bit hard for it to work in larger teams. So
Yeah.
when I've led teams of, say, 40 to 45, you can probably get through everyone in a year through, obviously, that mechanism, but other mechanisms that you have. But as your teams grow bigger and bigger, let's say if you're leading 200 to 300 people, it's a bit harder to do things. So you've got to find different ways to make sure that every team member feels seen. But those are just two tactics that you can use.
Yeah.
There's obviously different strategies that other people can use depending on their own personality and the way they go. But for me, those are a couple of things that I like to use to feel or make people feel like they feel seen and feel like they belong into the team.
Yeah, and this again ties into Gottman's research around warmth of connection. So the other next factor is appreciation. So what's your definition of that?
Yeah, for me, appreciation is making sure that your team members have the courage to share ideas with you. And so those ideas might not be ideas that you might necessarily agree with, but you want to be able to create an environment or a culture where people do feel like they have the courage to share the ideas that they have. And it's really important because I think it creates autonomy for them.
Yep.
But like I said, I think it creates appreciation. You appreciate their ideas. It doesn't mean you're going to listen to every single idea
Right.
that they have, but it's important to accept or hear what those ideas are about. Because as I said before, when it comes to acceptance, if you don't, you want people to feel like they're seen. If people don't feel like they're heard, they don't feel they're appreciated. If you want to create a high performing culture, it's really important that your team members feel appreciated.
Yeah, so just to clarify, this definition of appreciation is linked to psychological safety. The number one predictor of high performance teams is that feeling of safety, being able to speak up with ideas, concerns, mistakes, which falls under this category. You know, that appreciation for you as an intellectual being, that I have these blind spots that other people might be able to see things that I don't see. So it's really, again, fundamentally important. The last one, acknowledgement.
Yeah, look, acknowledgement, the way I define acknowledgement is how you value someone. So giving praise, so giving feedback, which is not just only praise, but also criticism. Criticism might sound like a bit of a harsh word, but I do think it's important that when you acknowledge someone, you show how much they value, and you can value them by giving them the praise. That's obviously super important. Praise that's specific, I think, is super important to give to your team members. But also I think it's important to criticize when there needs to be improvement. And I think I, as a leader in the past, I've sometimes not given that criticism. And I think what can happen is you wait to an annual performance review to give that criticism when that could have been done earlier, or even worse, you don't say anything. And that can be something that someone doesn't get an opportunity to learn from a mistake. And no one's perfect. I'm not saying that I'm perfect. I'm sure I make a lot of mistakes myself, but I want to hear from that on a regular basis. And I think when you do have a AAA culture, you can value and praise and acknowledge people in a way that really helps them develop. And I think that's the lens you want to look for in terms of why you're doing that, especially around that criticism piece as well, which I think is sometimes hard to hear. But I do want to say that I call it a AAA culture aim because you need all three elements. You can't just do the criticism without showing that team members feels like they're accepted and appreciated. I think it's got to be done all three together, and that's why I've turned that.
That criticism piece is actually really important to performance as well. What they found is when people are actually open to criticism, they learn so much more. So the question is, how do you set up a culture where people are willing to seek criticism? I wouldn't actually call it criticism because that's a negative term. I'm criticizing, that's shutting it down. Whereas maybe there's a way of framing that feedback. So this is where you are. It reminds me of one of my singing teachers in the past. It's every time he saw me perform, he's going, "Oh, you've come so far. This is amazing. But if you want to get to the next level, this is what you need to focus on." And it was a criticism in some sense, but it was appreciation. It's amazing work you're doing. If you want to take it to the next step, let's work on this. So it's a positive way of motivating rather than...
No, that's a really good point, Scott. I think that's a really good way of also using it in a different way. But I think at its premise, that acknowledgement piece is such an important pillar in terms of creating high performance culture, because if you can't do that, you can lose your people very quickly to other opportunities. And I think it's really important that if you want a high performing culture, you do need to make sure that people are praised, they do feel valued. You are pushing them to achieve more. I think that's also important as well. So yeah, spot on the way you've described it. That's probably a better way to go about things and say things in a way that really encourages them to grow even further.
Yeah. So it's not about avoiding those difficult conversations. It's how do you phrase that in a positive way, in some sense, that's motivating.
Yeah.
Because what happens is if you start with the criticism, and I'm not honest, you always do this. You get amygdala hijack, it shuts down the conversation. It doesn't go anywhere.
Correct. And it can't be a feedback sandwich as well.
No, it has to be honest.
Have to be done. Yeah, this is be honest. And it's got to be done over time. So we're not talking about, let's say I'm meeting you here, Scott, and I give you some praise and some constructive feedback and then some praise. Like, you'll just focus on the constructive feedback and not the two elements of praise. So I think it's over time making sure that there's acknowledgement of the people that you work with, and by acknowledging them, you're valuing them in the ways that we've just described.
That's another interesting piece I just want to end up on, because the research is showing that you don't need to be perfect, right? So even in personal relationships, a perfect relationship still has fights, but it's what happens between the fights that's actually more important. And that's where this praise and positive interaction is really important. So as you said, you don't have to be perfect as leader. You can say the wrong things occasionally and give occasional feedback that goes wrong, right? Or criticism or whatever. But on the whole, are you doing a lot of this praise and positive interaction that enables you to be imperfect in some sense? So the aim is not to be perfect, it's to be balanced in some way.
That's right, Scott. And I think it ties back to those other two pillars of acceptance and appreciation. If you've got those other two pillars, you have that kind of foundation of a really strong culture, a really strong high-performing culture. And then when you add the element or the pillar of acknowledgement, then that's how the three combined can really lead to a sense of belonging for your team members, and also that high-performing culture that teams are always trying to strive for.
Perfect. So if you could summarize these thoughts in a couple of sentences, what's your take-home message?
Look, my take-home message for the audience, Scott, is this triple A culture is really tactics and an idea for you to think about, which you can incorporate in your leadership. I think of it as the ingredients for the cake. I'm not going to give you the recipe for the cake because it really depends on the teams that you lead and the leadership style that you have. But I'm hoping that this model gives you an idea of some of the things that you might want to incorporate in your leadership style.
Perfect. And if people want to hear more about you, you're very active on LinkedIn, you have all this wonderful advice, where can they track you down?
LinkedIn's the best spot for me, Scott. You can also check out my website as well, www.timloh.com.au. But most of my 3 tidbits is on LinkedIn, and I've got a newsletter as well that people can join if they like what they're hearing on my website.
Perfect. And people can find out more about me at scottboland.com. Thank you once again, Tim. It's been awesome.
Thanks for having me, Scott. It's great to see you again.
Cheers. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe at succeedingscientifically.com. Cheers.